Today and tomorrow, what we're going to look at is the movement into the Constitution. So a couple of things that I think are really important for you to understand is as our founding fathers moved this nation forward after winning the Revolutionary War, the idea of a democracy and a government that they created didn't exist anywhere else. So it wasn't like they could look to other countries, look for someplace else to copy. They had to come up with things on their own. And a lot of this, the errors that they made with the Articles of the Confederation is due most in part is what they didn't want to have happen as they lived under the king. We don't want a strong leader. We don't want someone to be an authoritarian. We want to make sure that the people are represented. We don't want all these taxes. We don't want this big, huge army that could take over. So a lot of the things that they thought they didn't want, they actually really needed. And that, again, becomes the point of this new thing called a constitution. So there's a couple things I want you to take away from that. One is we started out with something that didn't work. It was an experiment. And those of you that are in chemistry, biology, any of those, I never, ever, ever in all of my science classes ever got an experiment that turned out the way it was supposed to. Ever. I was always writing my lab reports from, here's what went wrong, because I could never do that. I never in my whole entire life have seen anything in a microscope except my eyelashes. Can't. Mrs. Jenkins tries. I still don't see anything. So this is the point that these people are trying. It didn't work. And so we start all over again. We scrap that and we start all over again. I know because we know the story that we flourish as a country, but that is not what was assumed by Europe. And all of my friends of Hamilton know you'll be back. Just wait, you'll be back. Because no one thought that this thing would really work. All the way up until the Civil War, they thought this thing would never work. And the Civil War was really the time that we were going to implode on each other and France and Great Britain could come back and take us back over. I know that sounds silly to us, but it's 100% what was waiting. They're just hovering like buzzards. Okay, this is it. This is how they're going to end. They're going to have this Civil War, blow each other to smithereens, and then we can come back and take it over. We hadn't even really been a country 100 years when we start the Civil War. And again, 100 years in European history is a drop in the bucket. So when they meet to rewrite what eventually will become our Constitution, they've got really 4 things that they need to think about that take the biggest part of compromise over the Constitution. How states will be represented. How is that going to have impact? And we come up with quite possibly one of the most perfect little things is a bicameral house. We have the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and then we have the Senate, where everybody gets 2. So I like to compare the state of Wyoming, just because I kind of sort of know the population, and our state. The state of Wyoming has less than 600,000 people. Less than 600,000, yes, correct. Indianapolis has almost 1 million. I think Indianapolis almost has 1 million people. Yeah. But Indianapolis by itself has more people than the state of Wyoming. So in order to balance that out, Wyoming has 2 senators. Indiana has 2 senators. Representatives are based on population. So Indiana has 9. Wyoming has 1, just because they have to have 1. So most of those states in those upper western states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, they most of all of them just have 1 representative. We have 9, but as comparison, states like California have 52, Texas has 50 plus, Florida has 60 plus, New York has a gazillion of them because they are highly populated states. And if you want a really good example of what that means is take Indiana and Illinois, and if you ever drive from Indiana into Illinois, you can almost feel it instantaneously because you go from to really nice smooth roads. You don't close your eyes when you're driving, but you can close your eyes when you're riding and tell instantaneously when you hit Illinois because they probably have about 30 representatives. We have about 9. So what that means is dollar bills. So when when House passes out dollar bills, we just get 9. Texas is going to get $50. California is going to get 60 plus. So we lack that in our representation. So that's one thing that they figured out. That was a compromise. And you can figure out that the small states wanted everybody gets the same, and the large states, like Virginia, said we want it based on population. The second part of that population question is who's going to count? Who do we get to count as population? The South said, well, everybody, including the people that we're enslaving. And the North said, yeah, but you don't treat them like people, and they're not citizens, so you don't get to count them. And the North and the South understood if that did not happen, if they did not get to count their enslaved people, they would lose representation. And so the compromise was for that is called the 3/5 compromise, which means slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. And I hope that as it sinks in gives you the understanding that these were treated as less than human beings, that they counted as 3/5 of a person. That compromise again leads to another compromise. Well, if we're going to let you count slaves, then we need to end the slave trade. And first, though, there is absolutely no mention of the word slave in the Constitution. It's called servitude, which certainly is not a good representation of what slavery was. It was not servitude. It was enslaved. So the Continental Congress says, okay, we'll end the slave trade, meaning we will allow no more importation of slaves, meaning no more slaves can come into the United States. And that cutoff date, not good with dates, I'm just going to tell you, it's either 1803 or 1806. Fairly early in our history, we say no more new slaves, which should have, as most people thought, ended, began to taper off slavery, the institution of slavery. What happens is just the opposite. And hopefully most of you got that part in the video that the Cotton Gin is going to revive slavery as that result. So that part again. And then our last look at what the Constitutional Convention had to figure out is who's going to be our leader and how were we going to pick a leader. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were picked for a lot of things. One, because they were often the tallest people in the room. And then we're going to add on Thomas Jefferson, big old bright red-headed hair. George Washington was also a redhead as well, which most people don't know because he's, what? He's a ginger. They were both gingers. If you've ever been to Virginia or North Carolina, gingers. Like my family is the biggest ginger family of the world. My mom's bright red hair. Like people in North Carolina, like at my family reunion, like 3/4 of the people are redheads, like orange redheaded people, and freckles, of the whole ginger package. But they were tall. They were very tall for that time period. They were very tall, even for our modern times. So it made them very easy targets to pick out, the tallest people in the room. But we needed to pick a leader. We needed to figure out how we were going to pick a leader. And so we go to the fourth thing. How are we going to pick this leader? And hopefully most of you know, especially as we move into a presidential election, that presidents are elected by the Electoral College. And the purpose and the reason for that is our founding fathers didn't think we were smart enough to do that. So they set in place a system that really is what elects a president. The popular vote is generated not for the election of president, but for the election of electors. So Indiana has 13 electors. So when we vote in the state of Indiana, we are voting to what those 13 electors will do in January. And so that's how a president is and has always been elected, because the founding fathers said, we don't trust you guys. You're not that smart. You're not as smart as we are, so we're not going to let that popular vote go. I am 56 years old, and when I started making rational thoughts about politics and elections, I was probably about 17 years old. And since then, and I was 17 in 1980, I think. somewhere around there. There's always been talk about getting rid of the Electoral College. That's the only reason I was doing that. So for at least 30 plus years, there's always talk of getting rid of the Electoral College. I don't know that it will ever go away, but it is not an election by the people, because we have had several instances where the people voted one way and that the president won not the popular vote, but the Electoral College. And it wasn't just President Trump. Those of you that want to just think it's President Trump, it wasn't just President Trump. So it's been more than one president that won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. So that was another thing. How are we going to do that? And then once we elect this person, seriously, this was one of the biggest controversies. What are we going to call him? What are we going to call the president? If you watch any really good, historically accurate Revolutionary War movies, and if you ever read anything, George Washington was always referred to as Your Excellency, which is certainly not anything we think about as a term of a title in a democracy, calling someone Your Excellency, because that sounds very royal and noble. He was called Your Excellency throughout the whole Revolutionary War. When people wrote to him, he signed his own name that way. So there were a whole bunch of people at this Constitutional Convention that wanted to carry through with that and call the president His Majesty, but that's all we really knew, His Majesty. A lot of people, John Adams wanted that, a whole bunch of people. Obviously, a whole bunch of people said, no, we don't want that term. It has bad meanings. So they talked about 3 months about what we're going to call the president. And finally, I believe, and I might just be saying this because I like Ben Franklin so much, that it was Ben Franklin that said, how about we just say Mr. President? And that ends that controversy. So the next step for the Constitution was it has to be ratified by the 13 states. It had to be ratified by 2/3. It goes through, and then eventually it will be ratified. The biggest controversy about ratification is that what most people think of when they think of the Constitution is they actually think of the Bill of Rights. That wasn't part of the Constitution. It wasn't intended as part of the Constitution. There were many people that say we're not going to ratify that without the Bill of Rights. So the Constitution is ratified, and then within a few months, we add the Bill of Rights, those 10 amendments that provide what most people think the Constitution is about. Okay? Questions about any of that? Questions? All right, so that's all we're doing for today. Tomorrow we will start our final kind of review project on the Constitution. You'll have a little thing to do about the Constitution. And then next we'll move to Civil War. We'll watch the movie Gettysburg. And then that's the final thing that we'll do. And then we'll start with Chapter 4. All right? Is that good? All right. Make sure you're caught up with everything, that you've got everything turned in. Last call to get what was done yesterday in before I start looking.